Hey guys, Mint here. Today we're going to be talking about Shadow Priests and what you need to know about them when it comes to the Legion pre-patch. So let's start this thing off without any delays with talents. Now, the first tier, we're going to have Twist of Faith. After damaging a target below 35% health, you deal 20% increased damage and 20% increased healing for 10 seconds. Fortress of Mind, Mind Flay and Mind Blast deal 10% more damage and generate 20% more insanity. Shadow Word Void just does a bunch of damage and generates insanity on a recharge. Now, your default will be Twist of Faith for this tier just because Fortress of the Mind just doesn't really give us that much damage and insanity generation. Shadow Word Void, it just messes up with our Void form global cooldowns and just doesn't really fit in, even though it generates a lot of insanity, while Twist of Faith gives us a 20% increased damage for a very, very good chunk of the fight, because the fight will most likely have adds, and once we DPS the adds, our Twist of Faith will proc, and we'll have more uptime, so it will not just only be the boss execute phase, it will have an uptime during the boss fight as well. The second tier, it's pretty much 2 movement speed abilities and 1 healing ability. I really don't think anybody will ever use this, because you will never want to spend global cooldowns on healing yourself. Body and Soul I prefer myself because it is on demand, a very small shield, and a 40% increase in movement speed. This is just if you want to be lazy and you have just a movement speed increase regardless of what you're doing, just DPSing. Again, movement speed is very important for DPSing because the faster you can get from point A to point B, the faster you can continue casting. So, yeah. Casting is good, moving is not, unless you have Turn to Madness. We'll get into that. Third talent tree tier, we will not really talk about because there's not much to talk about. It's just very useless stuff. So yeah, let's just skip over to level 60. Void Lord. I believe I only use this when I play Legacy of the Void because I'll get into that as well. But Lingering Insanity persists for 8 seconds after your next Void form. That is the buff that you get after leaving Void form. So if you have 26 stacks of Void form, after you leave, it will have 26% haste for 60 seconds, which is very good. And this means that once you enter a new Void form, you will have that haste. For instance, 26 stacks, you'll have 26% extra haste for the first 8 seconds of Void form. It can increase your DPS. Reaper of Souls. Shadow Word Death is now castable on targets below 35% health. Wasn't it before? And always generates insanity as though it killed a target, which means it will generate 3 times more insanity. So each one will generate 30. This is amazing, and the whole premise of Shadow Priest has been changed, and it all surrounds generating as much insanity as possible, because the more insanity we generate, the longer we're in Void form. The longer we're in Void form, the more damage we do. Simple as that. Void Ray. Each time your Mind Flay or Mind Seer deals damage, you gain 10% increased Mind Flay and Mind Seer damage for 6 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. This just gives you another thing to micromanage and just not let fall off. The more haste you have, it will be easier to get the stacks back up. It is going to be a DPS increase, so if you want consistent damage, like a very good damage, you will pick this Void Ray ability. If you want increased Void form duration during execute phases and during adds, you will pick Reaper of Souls. And if you just want to be really, really lazy and just not think about it and pick Legacy of the Void plus this, you can just pick this for just casual playing. Now, in this tier, we have Sen Lane. I'm gonna butcher that, but whatever. Increases the damage of your Vampiric Touch by 20% and healing of your Vampiric Embrace by 20% as well. This is very bad because, as I said before, sanity is the most important thing, and this only increases our damage and of 1 dot. So it is very, very bad in my opinion, and I don't think it should ever be picked, even on multi-dot fights. Shadow Word Apparitions now deal 100% increased damage and generate 4 insanity. This is the default talent you will always pick. I'll explain why this is not good, but first things first, it does that crucial thing, increases our insanity generation, plus increases the damage of Shadow Apparitions, which we will have a lot, because we will have a lot of haste. A lot of haste means a lot of Shadow Word Pain ticks, which means a lot of Apparition procs. It just synergizes very well, and it is the best talent you can get for this tier. Shadow Insight, again, Shadow Word Pain periodic damage has a 10% chance to reset the remaining cooldown Mind Blast and cause your next Mind Blast to be instant. Now you're asking yourself, but this gives us Insanity as well, why do we not pick this? A very simple answer to that is these procs will be going on super often once we get high void form stacks. And this will mean even if we use this on cooldown and we ignore other spells just to use this, there is a chance that just missing one global cooldown will make this will make us waste a proc. So this just plays completely against how we're supposed to play a Shadow Priest. So at least right now, so it just makes all your rotation clunky and just doesn't give you a consistent insanity that you require to keep as much consistent high void forms as possible. And this gives us that. We're just without thinking, we have those apparitions. More can spawn at one time from one time. More can spawn on separate targets if we have more dots. It's just beautiful. Level 90 tier, we have Power Infusion. Infuses you with power for 20 seconds, increasing haste by 25% and increasing your insanity generation by 25% on a 2-minute cooldown. Again, this does very good things, and it will be helpful, but I don't think it is better than Mindbender. It just simply, it does give us a good damage increase, it does give us good insanity generation, but just what Mindbender gives us, it just cannot be parred with. Shadow Crash, this is a joke. It's a 30-second cooldown, gives very little insanity, does almost no damage, and it's very hard to hit on moving targets. This will never be picked even on AoE fights. Another off-topic thing, Mindseer does no damage, so our AoE is crap. So yeah, boohoo. At least we have more dots. Now, Mindbender, your go-to choice for this tier, it decreases the cooldown of our Shadow Fiend. So our Shadow Fiend was 3 minutes. Now with Mindbender, it's 1 minute. The duration is the same, and now it generates Insanity. So again, that crucial thing that we're looking for, insanity. You want to be as insane as possible, and this gives us insanity, while Shadow Fiend does not. Now this, you will want to use this as often as possible. So if you have a 5-minute fight, you want 5 mind benders. If you have a 6-minute fight, 6 mind benders. If you have 5 on a 6-minute fight, that will be a huge DPS loss, and that will mean that you're not a very good Shadow Priest. Keep that in mind. You want to use those. Again, it's optimal to use those while you're in void form to increase your insanity generation and to keep you in void form for longer, but if that means you're going to be losing on one entire mindbender for the fight just so you can save it for that void form, that doesn't mean it's going to be an increase because you're losing an entire cooldown for that fight. So use it as often as possible. If you can squeeze it in and just organize it, delay by 5-10 seconds just so you can use it at the perfect time in the void form, do it. If you're going to delay it for like half a minute, that is going to be a DPS loss. Now, here we have 3 options, but essentially we have 2. The way I like to call these 2 options is progression and non-progression. Now, this is very loose wording of this because I'm going to get into it right now. First thing I want to get Mind Spike off the table. Assail the target with shadowy spikes, dealing shadow frost damage and leaving a spike embedded in their mind. Mind Blast will detonate these spikes, each dealing 200% of their original damage to the main target and 100% to all nearby targets. Now, this does nothing. I mean, it does good damage, everything, but it just works completely away from like how therapy is supposed to be played, same as Shadowy Insight. Like, you will have very low cooldown Mind Blast, especially once you get into those void forms. You will not have time to cast Mind Spikes to make them worth it. And being able to control and like, okay, I can have a full Mind Flay here, I can clip it here. It just makes you so flexible because you'll have so low cooldowns that you can Mind Flay just works perfectly. Where Mind Spike, once you start casting it, you're stuck for 1.3 or whatever seconds of a cast. So you can lose a lot of void bolts, a lot of mind blasts, a lot of shadow word deaths, just because you have to cast this and it doesn't even do that much more damage. So it just doesn't work with the Shadow Priest, and plus you get much more from the other 2 towns. The first one I want to touch on is Legacy of the Void. Void Form may be activated anytime your insanity level is 70 or higher. Why I call this the progression talent is because from Surrender to Madness, you want to know the fight perfectly. Because with Surrender to Madness, you will reach insane amounts. Literally, you will reach insane amounts of insanity with Void Form. So you will have like almost you will be GCD capped, which was like 0.75 seconds, I believe. You will have a very different rotation once you reach insane amounts of haste, and you will just if you miss one single global cooldown, you will die. That's it. You will die. And that means you have to know, firstly, you have to be very comfortable with the rotation that you have on high void form stacks. And you have to know the fight perfectly and be able to avoid every single movement impairing, not movement impairing, more like every single stun, silence, everything. You have to know if the boss has it. So if the boss has stuns, silences that you cannot avoid in the execute phase, you will not be using Surrender to Madness in that fight. Simple as that. If you can avoid them, and if you know how to avoid them, you will use it, and you will do insane amounts of DPS. Again, insanity, insane. Oh, my jokes are so amazing. Now, Legacy of the Void, while again, I've just explained it, you're using it because you will not die if you mess up, and you will mess up on a progression fight that you're seeing for the first time. It will give you less DPS, that is a given, but you will not die if you mess up, so yeah, you will do more DPS alive, believe me. One thing I want to touch on this one is you do not want to use your Void Eruption straight away. So you want to be around 85 insanity is the sweet spot when you want to use Void Eruption. It's just not because I think so, it's just because it's been simmed and a lot of much smarter people that just worked on this and just simmed the crap out of this just calculate that 85 is the sweet spot to use Void Eruption and just do it. Now, Surrender to Madness, the game-breaking cooldown that Blizzard introduced for Shadow Priests. It's a instant cast and a 10-minute cooldown. All your insanity generating abilities generate 200% more insanity. And you cast while moving until your next void form. Then you die horribly. The last two sentences mean that if you die with Shadow Word or Surrender to Madness, I can't speak, that means you cannot be battle resed. So that's a thing to keep in mind. You cannot like abuse what's it called, soul stones, battle reses to just keep using those like twice in a fight or some specific way midpoint of fight. Maybe sometimes it will be more worth it for a shadow priest to sacrifice himself mid fight so you can like do insane amounts of burst and get through that very difficult mid portion of the fight and then just be dead for the rest of it and still be able to like kill the boss more efficiently. There might be cases and you will have to sacrifice your guild if that's so. If not, yeah, you will use it in the execute phase of the fight. So one thing I want to touch upon is Surrender to Madness is tightly connected with Reaper of Souls and Void Ray. You will only have those two options when you're using Surrender to Madness. If you have a boss fight where you're required to do damage in about a 3-minute period and just have to do more overall damage, you will pick Reaper of Souls because that will give you about a 3-minute uptime on your Void form, but overall you will do less DPS, but more damage because it's 3 minutes. Now Void Ray on the other hand will give you about a 2-minute Void form uptime, higher DPS through those 2 minutes, but overall less damage because it will last 1 minute less. So those two options keep in mind and just play with it depending on the fight. There's no best talent. I mean, there is Spirits and Twist of Fate, but the other ones just have to think about it and just look at the fight and see how well do you know the fight. If I know the fight very well, I'm going to pick Surrender to Madness. I'm just going to do insane amounts of damage. If I don't know the fight, I'm still learning it. I'm going to pick Legacy of the Void. So I'm not going to die if I mess up and if I mess up one global cooldown. So just think about those things and just let's move over to spells. Now, I'm not going to talk about like other miscellaneous spells. I'm just going to talk about DPS spells. And believe it or not, the first one is going to be Dispersion. Dispersion to pure shadow energy for 6 seconds, reducing all damage you take by 60%, which is reduced from like 90% what was before, but you are unable to attack or cast spells. Castable while stunned, feared, or silenced, clears all snare and movement impairing effects when cast, and makes you immune to them while dispersed. Void form does not drain insanity while dispersed. Now, because of that last sentence, Void Dispersion is a DPS cooldown. So keep that in mind. So what I've heard, I haven't really experienced that myself, but if you get CC'd when you're in Void form, excuse me, if when you're in Dispersion, uh, your insanity will start dropping. I'm not sure how accurate that is. I might be completely wrong, but just keep that in mind. But what you want to do with Dispersion, I'm just gonna do a quick demo. So I'm gonna build up my insanity so I can pop Void Form. So what you want to do is pop Dispersion as soon as you cast your first Void Bolt in your Void Form. So I'm gonna pop it early just because I want to show this off. So I'm gonna pop my Void Bolt and instantly pop my Dispersion. Now this will keep my insanity. See, everything is generating, everything else is generating, but as soon as I go out, I have 11 stacks. So now I can keep going with starting off from a full bar of insanity from like a 16 void form stacks. So that just gives me a bigger edge to just squeeze out a larger void form. So as you can see, I got 26 stacks there. Now if I didn't do that, the first part with dispersion, I would, with this like very shit gear, 681, I would have gotten like 19, 21 at the best void form. So as you can see, that just that dispersion gives you a DPS increase, just because you're gonna have a higher lingering insanity, and then if you have Void Lord for your slackers out there, you will have a higher DPS in your next void form, and everything will just tie in so perfectly. So you want to use this again. You want to use this as many times as possible during the fight. If you're using Surrender to Madness, you want to plan it so that you have your void form for that. You want to have a dispersion for your Surrender to Madness void form proc. Uh, so, for instance, if you have a very short, like 2.5 minute fight, if that even exists, you will not use dispersion until that last void form. And if you have like a 6 minute fight, 4 minute fight, you will use dispersion in your first void form, and then use it on the very last, or just be able to squeeze in as many of them as possible. Now, before I get off on another tangent, let's keep going. The next one is Mind Blast. It's your spell that you know if you play the Shadow Priest, does damage. It's a cast. It has a cooldown that will be scaled with your haste and generates insanity. You will want to use this on cooldown. I'll get into the spell rotation and spell priority later on. Mind Flay, the spell that you know, just a channel that does damage, generates insanity. It's your main filler spell. This is your quote unquote AoE spell, even though it does literally no damage. But the only good part about it is it generates a lot of insanity. So if you have 3 or more targets, your Mind Flay will be replaced with Mind Seer, just because it generates more insanity. As we talked about, insanity means DPS. Insanity, insane DPS. Hey, Mindbender. Now, this spell I've touched about it when I was talking about talents, so I won't need to talk about it again. Let's keep going. We have Shadow Word Death. Now, this is our execute ability. It does a lot of damage, generates 10 insanity, which is less than Mind Blast when when it's not talented. So it's not really up on our priority list, but we want to use one charge of it at all times. So if we can use Shadow Word Death, we always want that one charge to be recharging. So uh, that's pretty much it. So yeah. And if you have that one charge left and it's just recharging, and you have a high movement phase of the fight, and you have no other instant cast, so if you don't have anyone to refresh Shadow Word Pain on, use the second stack. It will be a higher DPS to use that instant cast rather than to just walk around with, yeah, not casting anything. So use 2 of them in a row if you have to when you're moving. Shadow Word Pain, not much to talk about, just our dot. Vampiric Embrace, we all know what it does. It's just been nerfed a little bit. Vampiric Touch again generates insanity. It's just our dot that we always had. Void Eruption. Now this is what replaced our Shadow Orbs. Now releases an explosive blast of pure void energy, activating void form and causing X amount of shadow damage to all enemies inflicted by your Shadow Word Pain or Void Touch. Void Touch. Vampiric Touch. During Void form, this ability is replaced by Void Bolt. Requires 70 insanity because I have Legacy. If you don't, it would require 100 insanity. Again, its cooldown is reduced by haste. That means that's the green text. You want to use this whenever possible. You never want to overcap on your insanity. You want to, like, the premise of Shadow Priest is you want to be in Void form as much as possible for as long as possible. The longer you are in, the more haste you get, the more damage you get, and just the more damage you do. So Void form, Void form, Void form. Now that's just our mastery, our apparitions that proc off of dots when they critically hit. If we have that talented, which we should, it will generate insanity and do more damage. Now, Void Bolt, this is the ability that is replaced with Void Eruption once you enter Void form. Sends a bolt of pure Void energy at the enemy target, causing X amount of shadow damage and refreshing both of your dots. Requires Void form. It is instant cast and has a very low cooldown, which is scaled by haste, which is very important. Now, uh, you want to use this spell as often as possible. This is your highest priority spell, and once you reach like insane amounts of haste, this will literally be spammed every second global cooldown, so it will be insane amounts of damage. What separates a good from a great Shadow Priest is having the ability to use this and shuffle it between targets to keep dots up. Like, if you're in Void form, the last thing you want to do is refresh your dots. You want to be using your Mind Blasts, your Void Bolts, your Shadow Word Deaths, everything else that generates actual insanity, rather than just refreshing your dots. You want to use this to refresh your dots. You can comfortably keep up dots on 3 targets just by using Void Bolt. So you have to practice that. You have all these dummies. Use them 3 dots, Void Bolts. Practice, practice, practice. Void form, this is what we've been talking about. While in Void form, well, this is your bread and butter, so when you're in Void form, you do 20% increased damage, reduces the cooldown of your Mind Blast by 3 seconds, grants an additional 1% haste for every 1 second you are in Void form. Your insanity drain will increase, so the higher you're in Void form, the more it will drain. And when Void form ends, your lingering insanity, allowing the haste to persist for 1 minute or until your next Void form. So that's the buff that we see after we leave Void form. So that's pretty much it for our spells. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about is our stat priority. And then I'm going to talk about the rotation of the spells, the priority of the spells. So let's get right into that. So, when it comes to our stat priority, we have two very different sections. So we have our Legacy, or Legacy of the Void, that is a stat priority, and we have our Surrender to Madness priority. Now for Legacy, if the fight is going to be purely a single target, the priority goes like Intellect, Haste, Crit, Versatility, Mastery. We always want as much haste as possible when we're using Legacy. We have like no haste cap, like we want as much as possible. When there are 2+ targets, the haste applies the same as well, obviously. We have a small change, so it's going to be Intellect, Haste, and Crit about the same, Mastery and Versatility. So we have a small change where Mastery and Versatility change places, as well as Haste and Crit become almost equally as important. So keep that in mind. So if you have, for instance, if there's a single target fight, if you have a one piece of gear that gives you more haste than crit and more versatility than mastery, like you can swap around and get more DPS. If you have more targets, you can like get a bit more crit, balance it out, get more mastery instead of versatility, and just play around with it if you have access to more gear. Now, for Surrender to Madness, there's a very specific thing. You want your haste to around 22%. Now, for the reason for this is because the only time you will reach 100 void form stacks is if you use Surrender to Madness, and the reason you want 22% around 22% haste is because once you go past the 120% haste mark, your rotation will change completely. And I will talk about that later. So that's why you want haste at 22% if you have Surrender to Madness. If you don't have 22% haste, don't even bother, because you will not be able to keep up the full 2 or 3 minute duration I've been talking about. The next one would be, so haste above all, above intellect, above everything. So then the next one would be crit. which is equal to intellect. So crit and intellect are about the same value. Then we have mastery, then we have versatility. So keep that in mind. You have to get that haste point if you want to run Surrender to Madness. Now let's talk about that rotation. Now, when it comes to rotation for Shadow Priest, there isn't really a rotation. Well, actually, there is, but for a very specific purpose and very specific timing. So, first things first, let's talk about the priority. So, you always want to have in mind this. When you're out of Void form, your priority is first, use Mindbender on cooldown. Second, use Mind Blast on cooldown. You want those two things on cooldown at all times. Use third one would be to use one charge, specifically one charge of death. I've touched about before that if you have to use a second charge, it's in high movement parts, etc., etc. Or if you can execute a target and get that 30 insanity, even though you don't have the talent, because Shadow Word Death gives you 10 insanity if you use it on less than 35% health, and if that kills the target, you will get 3 times insanity, so 30. So keep that in mind. And fourth on your priority list would be to keep both of your dots up. So if you have a dot falling off and the Mind Blast off cooldown, you want to use Mind Blast, then refresh that dot. Keep that in mind. And the fifth one would be to use your filler spells, which is Mind Flay or Mind Spike if for some reason you decide to use it. Now Void form. So you have two phases, so two big phases. So out of Void form and then Void form. That was out of Void form. So in Void form, your priority is Void Bolt. Void Bolt has to be on cooldown 24/7. You have to use that spell constantly, and that spell refreshes your dots. So that frees you up to just spam other spells and just generate as much beautiful insanity as possible and to get as high of a Void form stack as possible. Now, what separates a very good Shadow Priest from a decent Shadow Priest is being able to shuffle that Void Bolt around up to 3 targets and keep up your dots without even refreshing them, or physically refreshing them through Void Bolt. So you can comfortably keep dots up on 3 targets. So if you set it up so that you have dots rolling on 3 targets, and then you enter Void form, you will first use Void Bolt on the first of those 3 targets that you put dots on, because that will have the lowest duration. Then you have to keep the sword in mind, unless you will, otherwise it will fall off. Then you will have to use Void Bolt on the second target you dotted, then on the third one. Then the cooldown of Void Bolt will start going so low that you can just swap around between those 3 targets constantly, and you will keep those dots up without even refreshing them by physically casting the dots. So that's going to be a huge DPS increase and a huge insanity generation increase. Uh, Next one on the list is Mind Blast. Then after that is to use your Mindbender if it's not on if it's off cooldown now. Then the fourth one would be to use your Shadow Word Death. Again, now you would want to use your second stack over using a filler in this at this point, because you want to generate as much insanity while in void form, and a GCD of a Shadow Word Death will generate more than a filler spell. So you would want to use your second stack of Shadow Word Death over using a filler spell such as Mind Flame. Keep that in mind. Sixth one would be to use, if you don't have Mindbender talent on, you would use your Shadow Fiend only when you have above 10 stacks of Void form and it is on correctly on the priority list. So if your Void Bolt is off cooldown, if your Mind Blast is off cooldown, if your Shadow Word Death is off cooldown, then you use Shadow Fiend, because it doesn't generate insanity, it just does a lot of damage. It will do more damage the most haste you have, so the later in the void form you use it, the better. Keep that in mind. And the last on the list would be to use your filler spell. Now, this is a bit more complicated, let's say, because it has seven points to it. Actually, I forgot one. Number 5 would be to dot new targets, but that's off the point, because you will mostly not want to do that because you would lose insanity. Like, for instance, if you're at the very beginning of the void form, you would have time to actually dot new targets, but once you get up to like 20, 30, 50 stacks, if you cast Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain on a new target, you're already out of void form. So sometimes it would not be beneficial to dot new targets. Now, on those 7 points, you have a set a loosely set rotation when you're in void form. So when you're under 122% haste, so if you don't have, that is, if you don't have Shadow Word, what's happening here? So if you don't have Shadow Surrender to Madness, so if you're using the other two talents, you will never get 120% haste. So when you're in Void form, your rotation would be to use Void Bolt, use Mind Blast, use one of your fillers, Void Bolt again, two fillers, and repeat the rotation. That's if you're 122% haste. That means the global cooldowns, the cooldowns of the spells will align, so you can roughly get that rotation in. Now, once you get into those high haste points and you get really insane with 122% plus, your rotation will be something like Void Bolt, Mind Blast, Void Bolt, one filler, Void Bolt again. That is the rotation again. So as you can see, the higher your insanity gets, not insanity, your void form gets, and the higher your haste gets, the less fillers you'll be able to have. And obviously your filler does the least amount of damage, so you will be able to do your big hitting abilities constantly on the global cooldown, which will result you being in a machine gun of spells and just do insane amounts of burst within that point. So that's pretty much it. And I'm gonna have a demonstration of this play in the background, so you'll see how that goes. Now, I can't really expect much from this character because it only has eye level 681, so I can't really show off that much. But if you put all this that I've taught you today in practice, you will see an increase in your Shadow Priest DPS. Just keep that in mind and have fun playing this insane spec, because it is a mouthful to play, because once you start reaching those high void forms, it just gets insane to play. You have to micromanage everything, and it's just amazing. Like, yeah, have fun with it. It's an amazing spec. Now, as the end of the video, I would really like to thank Melgain and Twintop from How to Priest. They have two very thorough guides that were written and that will just get over anything that I've missed in this guide. They're like Melgain has a very in-depth Legion guide for Shadow Priest, so you can check out. I'll put in the description. Twintop, I got his some of his weak cores, such as the Shadowy Apparition one, which is very amazing, helps you out a lot. So check those guys out, and if you liked this guide, make sure to subscribe to see more guides. I will be putting all sorts of guides for World of Warcraft, even news and such. If you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button. If you didn't like it, well, obviously hit the dislike button. If you have any suggestions or even questions about the Shadow Priest, make sure to put it down below in the comment section. And until next time.